Welcome. Thank you guys all for being here. We're going to start class now. So we're doing this series called I Will, 9 Traits of the Outwardly Focused Christian. And last week there was no class, right? We just had service. So I still want to thank Jeff.
We were prepared for it.
Because, Jeff volunteered to teach. And he was going to teach class for us last week. And then it didn't actually happen. But I still want to thank you for kind of prepping and getting that ready and being willing to do that. At the beginning of the summer, I built in one day in our class series as kind of a flex day to see if there was other topics that might come up that we wanted to discuss. We ended up kind of needing to use that because of the power outage. So thankfully, we'll still have enough time to finish the book. And I think at the very end, we'll still have a little bit of time for more of just kind of reflections and general questions or things like that. But if you remember 2 weeks ago, we did a little class on another book by the same author called Anatomy of a Revived Church. So just as a recap, the author here, Tom Rainer, used to be the president of the Lifeway Christian bookstore, and he's also been a minister in churches. And more recently, he's done church consulting, where he'll go to all kinds of different churches when they're faced with some sort of problem or crisis, or maybe they've been in decline for a while. He has a lot of experience with a lot of different kinds of church contexts. He's seen a lot, and so he's drawing on his experiences and sharing some of the lessons that he's learned, sometimes by observing churches that have gone through really hard times. So he wrote the one book called Autopsy of a Deceased Church, which studied churches that had to close, kind of what went wrong, and he wrote a book to say, these are some of the mistakes they made. Try not to make these in your churches too if you want to be successful, if you want to, stay open for a long time and keep doing the Lord's work. Well, he wrote another book, and that's the one that we talked about a couple weeks ago, Anatomy of a Revived Church. And this was looking at churches that started to decline, but then said, hey, we're not going to go down that path. We need to do something different. We want to do what it takes to change and to grow and to start doing things a little bit differently so that we don't have to close. So that book looked at a lot of the traits of those churches that did, they made that decision to change and to revitalize. So it kind of looked at what went well there and maybe some things that we can do to follow in those footsteps. Today, there's 2 more chapters in the book. The last chapter is really, really short. So this is probably the last full-length chapter. But what we're going to talk about today is the chapter is called I Will Avoid the Traps of Churchianity, which is a made-up word. He even admits that. He said, this isn't a word, but it feels like it should be. I will avoid the traps of Churchianity. I'll tell you a little bit more about that word in a minute. But the goal here is to acknowledge, as followers of Jesus, to acknowledge that sometimes we prefer to follow God on our own terms instead of doing it the way the Bible talks about. We acknowledge that. And then to recommit to following Jesus the way God teaches us to do things according to the Bible instead of sort of the rules that we like to make up. Okay? So I mentioned this word churchianity. Tom Rainer defines it as, and again, he admits this isn't a word, feels like it should be. He kind of defines it as practicing our church and religious beliefs according to human standards rather than biblical guidelines. Does that make sense? He says, okay, think about the way that sometimes we like to do things our way instead of God's way, to kind of make up our own rules about what church is or what following Jesus is like. We like to kind of come up with our own set of standards for that. And when we choose to live by those standards instead of what God has actually told us in the Bible, he says, let's use the word churchianity to describe that. And it kind of reminds me of the super awesome movie Princess Bride, where you have this character, and his famous quote from that is, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Now in the movie, what was the actual word? Inconceivable, that's right. But maybe we could substitute a couple other words in there, like discipleship, or following Jesus, or Christianity. When we have our own definition of what that means, being a Christian means going to church at least 50% of the time and not complaining when I'm there. That's what it means to be a Christian. Okay, so we've made up our own definition of what it is, and as long as we hit that standard that we ourselves have created, we feel like I'm a good Christian because I go to church at least half of the time, and I mostly don't complain when I'm there, okay? So, but we're using a word in a way that's very different than the way God talks about it in the Bible. So we're using words like Christianity, discipleship, worship, devotion, generosity. We're using these words, but they probably don't mean exactly what God says they mean. And that's what he talks about with this this word, churchianity. Any questions on that so far? All right. Well, I want you to think about running a race. Has anyone run a 5K before? Ha, I like that joke. Yeah. Yeah? Okay, anyone run a 10K or longer? Anyone run a half marathon? Anyone run a full marathon? Hey, anyone run 10 marathons in a row? Okay, good. All right, so there's an upper limit on this. Okay. So RF has run a marathon. Dustin, have you run a marathon? Yeah? Unfortunately. Okay, yeah. The longest I've ever run was probably, it wasn't even a 5K. It was maybe about 2 miles nonstop on a treadmill. And I felt pumped that I was able to run that far without just collapsing and falling over, okay? I generally only run if someone says there's free tacos down that way. I'll go run for that. Or if I'm being chased by someone that I think is trying to hurt me. Okay, I'll run in that situation. Or if I see my kids doing something very dangerous, I'll run over and try and stop them. Okay, so all that to say, I'm not exactly ready to wake up tomorrow morning and run a 5K or a 10K. Certainly not a marathon. Okay, I'd have a lot of work to do. So if the Lord himself came down and said, Bryan, I want you to train to run a 10K race. I want you to get ready for that. I've got a couple options here because number one, I can't do that tomorrow. I'm not physically able to do that. So one thing that I could do is to water down the goal and say, look, when God came down and told me to run a 10K race, what he really meant was he wants me to be a little bit healthier. He recognizes eating pizza and cheeseburgers and tacos all week, that's not a very healthy thing to do. So when he said run a 10K, what he really meant was you should try and be a little bit healthier. So I'm going to cut back from 3 tacos on Taco Tuesday to just 2 tacos with a side of chips because I'm being a little bit healthier and that's what God wants anyway. So what are you hearing in all of that? In my sort of rationale, I've changed what God has said from run a 10K to eat 1 less taco. What are you hearing in my conversation there?
You've already used the word. It's rationalization.
Rationalization, yeah.
You're rationalizing in your brain what that really meant, and you're making excuses for doing what you're going to do, even though that's not really what the original plan should have been.
That's right, yeah.
And I want to add something to
for sure.
Concept of, so one of my favorite expressions in just success principles in general, success is a planned event. And the other one is people don't fail to plan, they plan to, or, yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Right. Something like that. Something along those lines.
I'd have to write it down. But it's when you're talking about this training, it's a plan, and it has to be an organized plan. You can't just, today I'm going to do this. Olympic athletes, they don't become Olympic athletes by accident.
Right. There's a lot of training, intentional training, planning. Yeah, you don't just wake up one day and maybe I'll try out for the Olympics and then make the team. That doesn't happen like that. Jeff?
I think there's 2 sides of this coin about watering down the goal. It's either you don't believe you're capable of achieving the goal, or you really don't want to achieve the goal.
Yeah.
It's one of the other.
I don't think there's any way I could really do this, so why try? Or I really don't want to put in this effort to try and reach this goal. That sounds painful. That sounds like it's going to take sacrifice. I really don't want to have to do that, right? If I have to give up my tacos in order to run this race, that's a high cost. I'm not willing to pay that, right? That's crazy, right? So yeah, if God says, I want you to run the 10K, and I water that down to, he probably just means I want you to be a little bit healthier. I think there's ways that we do that in our faith too. When Jesus says things like, I want you to take up your cross daily and follow me, we kind of changed that to, well, I should try to go to church more often than not. You know, it's watering down the goal. Oh, God wants me to be a good person. He wants me to be spiritual. So as long as I own a Bible, then I'm doing better than a lot of people, right? And so we take what he says, we try and imagine what the real intent behind it is, and 99% of the time what we're imagining is a statement from God that makes it a lot easier for us to follow. We're kind of watering it down. The alternative would be for me to rise to the occasion, to get serious about eating right, exercising, building up slowly, setting a long-term goal, and getting someone to hold me accountable to that, and doing the work in order to rise to the occasion. I'm physically capable of running a 10K. There's nothing like medically that would stop me from doing that. The only thing that's stopping me is, right now, it's a lack of desire. No accountability, no one's forcing me to do it. It's just not something that I'm even that interested in trying, right? So if I were serious about it, though, then I would need to take some steps to rise to the occasion. So churchianity is when we say, okay, we've got this teaching from Jesus about what discipleship means, the life of a disciple, and instead of relying on the power of the Spirit and our church family, the strength that Jesus gives to rise to the occasion, it's much more convenient for us to just water down the goal and all kind of decide together. Christianity is basically about being a good person and trying to go to church more often than not.
You could transpose on there the parable Jesus talks about the wide path and then the narrow path.
Yeah.
On top. So wide path versus narrow path.
Yeah.
And the narrow path is rising to the occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. Watering down the goal is the wide path, and rising to the occasion is the narrow path. Few people actually choose that. Yeah. So he talks about some of the symptoms, some of the common signs that go along with this attitude of churchianity, of kind of watering down the expectations of what it means to be a church member or a disciple of Jesus. This is from his book, 5 Symptoms. Church becomes a spectator sport. So people show up at church, but they're there to watch. They're there as outsiders. They're there just to kind of enjoy the experience rather than showing up with the expectation that they're going to be involved, they're going to serve. They'll attend sporadically without really participating. And then when they see something happening that they don't really like, they will bless the church with their valuable opinion about the way it should be going instead. Okay. Also, another symptom is that church becomes all about me, which we've talked about on several occasions in this class. Country Club Christianity. The church exists primarily to meet my needs. And when it stops doing that, I'm going to stop going to church, because if it's not meeting my needs, then why bother anymore? That's the attitude that we have about consumer products and businesses, but it's not really the right attitude to have about church. Another symptom is that church is about dwelling on we dwell on the flaws of the church. We see everything that's going wrong. Something the church does is the church ends up having low expectations for its members. They don't really expect anyone to contribute, to participate, to serve. They're just so desperate for people to show up that they don't want to scare people away by saying, hey, if you're part of the church family here at Southwest, that means you're going to be involved in a ministry in some way, and you're going to get plugged into a small group, and we hope to see you volunteering in our kids program at least once a year. The church is almost afraid to say, here's the expectations, because they don't want to scare people away. And the church knows that there's other churches out there too. And if you make things too hard, if people really feel like church is all about them, and you start making things pretty hard, trying to get them to rise to the occasion, if the church members don't have the right attitude about that, they're probably going to leave and go to a church that's enabling them to just be a spectator. So there's things that the church needs to be doing differently. There's things that we as members need to be doing differently. And one of the other things is that the church can have a cliquish membership, which no church thinks it's that church, but most of them probably are a little bit. And the way that usually happens is people start coming to a church and they get really good relationships at that church, and you've been at a church for 5 or 10 years, and you show up and it feels like a really friendly church because you know a lot of people and you know your people really well. So those tight-knit relationships are awesome for you, It's just hard for someone new to break into that who doesn't have the same 5 or 10 or 15 years of shared experiences to build on. So the problem is that everyone feels like they're being friendly, but the people who are there for the first time have a hard time breaking into those strong relationships. So something that churches need to do, and it feels really hard and even uncomfortable, is when all of the church members are there hanging out and having fun and saying hi to each other during church, you almost need to say, wait a minute, I don't want to talk to you right now. Let me go see if there's someone new that I can meet. So you kind of have to intentionally not talk to your friends so that you can go and find people who are new and build those relationships. Yeah.
I think that can be an added layer to that can be like when you have a Christian college close by, like York College. I went there for 2 years, and so you have a history with various people, and you find out, oh, you went to York too, and then someone who's new or visiting is like, what is York?
Right.
And if you are
It's like a peppermint patty.
so there's this, that itself can be a cliquishness that we don't intend to do because it's, fun to meet someone who has a shared connection.
Yeah.
But we have to be careful about those things.
Yeah, and even the language that we use can be sort of insider versus outsider. Like at our last church in California, we had an abbreviation for almost every room in the building. Oh, like we're going to have our men's breakfast in the MAC. Or our ladies' Bible class is in the WAC. We're going to have VBS in the FLC, and if it's not in the FLC, then check the hub, okay? And so none of that makes any sense to someone who's new, because we're using words and phrases that it's completely insider language. So even, like you said, even if it's not the relationship itself or a clique, there can be shared language, shared history, sort of inside jokes that set a clear line between who belongs and who doesn't, like insiders and outsiders. So those are some of the symptoms. So if we wanted to flip that, you can just you can think about what the opposite would be like. Church becomes, instead of a spectator sport, everyone is a servant, not a spectator. Church is not necessarily all about me. It's about how I can serve and bless others, how we can support each other. We don't dwell on the church's flaws. We understand no church is perfect. We try and do our part to make things better, to improve. The church has low expectations for its members. That's about developing a culture that says we're going to push each other to rise to the occasion, and we're not going to be jerks about it. We're not going to get on people's cases when they don't measure up. I mean, there's still love and grace and patience, but we are going to have a healthy culture of no, let's do it, let's go, let's get involved. And instead of having a cliquish membership, we're going to say our primary job is to make new people feel welcome and included. So if we could develop those kinds of attitudes, I think we would do well at avoiding churchianity. So if churchianity is taking God's standard and redefining it in a way that's easier for us to handle, sort of watering down the goal, then I think this quote from Francis Chan kind of makes sense. I want you to think about this for a second. You guys heard of Francis Chan before? Wrote Crazy Love, Forgotten God, megachurch pastor, and got burned out on kind of that culture of megachurch evangelical Christianity. And now he's done house church kind of stuff, and now he's just sort of like a pastor in a regular church. It's kind of an interesting story. He says, our greatest fear should not be of failure, but of succeeding at things in life that don't really matter. So if we applied that to this concept of churchianity, what if we succeeded at a version of Christianity that is very different than what God talks about in the Bible? If we create this definition of Christianity, church is mostly about avoiding the really bad sins that we see in culture. It's about owning a Bible and reading it occasionally and trying to go to church. If that's the definition and then we succeed at that, we've succeeded at something that, although each of those things is good, it's not really what God talks about in the Bible. We're almost giving ourselves a false sense of security by hitting this goal that is completely different than the goal that Christ has given us. Thoughts, comments, or questions?
That sounds like a works church, right?
Check the boxes. Yeah, as long as they do the thing. Yeah. Okay, good. Other thoughts?
My thought was about, what if our church is booming and people are just coming through the doors because we've modified and watered down the gospel to say
Yeah.
what? Something more comfortable.
Yeah. Have you guys ever heard of the book, DVD series, Not a Fan by Kyle Idleman? It's good stuff, yeah. You guys might check that out if you can find it somewhere. There's a book, there's a DVD series, I think it's like 6 parts. But the big thing that he talks about in there is there's a pretty big difference between being a fan of Jesus, the way you might be a fan of the Dodgers or fan of Star Wars or fan of even the Cardinals, you know, like you might be devoted to your team. Being a fan of something is different than having a deep personal relationship with it. And it's also very different than being a true follower, like dedicated, devoted. So he says a lot of people are fans of Jesus, like, yeah, I'm cool with Jesus, but they're not actually following him as their Lord, as their master. So I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying a little bit. It's not just about sort of being an acquaintance of Jesus. It's about being his student, seeing him as Lord and master, the one that we submit to and obey. Jane?
Our modern words today, the watered down things are inclusion
Okay.
and tolerance.
Those words, there's good and bad applications of those things. When it's sort of the ultimate goal, it can feel somewhat like an idol. Inclusion, tolerance. I think there's something noble in it. I don't want to just throw it out completely, but it can turn into something where it's an end goal in and of itself that's a little bit divorced from a call to holiness or purity or righteousness or changed life. And that's where it gets a little problematic for me. But I agree with your point. Yeah. Well, let me share this quote from the book. Oh, it's already up here. Actually, I'd like a volunteer to read this for us. Would anyone be willing to read this quote from the book I Will for us?
Biblical church life is about serving, about sacrificing, about giving, and about putting others before our own desires and needs. Churchianity is about being served, receiving, getting our way, and insisting on our needs and wants before others.
Yeah, thanks. It kind of summarizes a big theme that we've been discussing throughout the summer, which is the difference of the attitude of church of it's there to meet my needs versus I'm here to serve. As I've read through this and taught through it over the summer, that's been kind of the main theme that I've been picking up on. And I've read this book before too. It's been a couple years, but coming back to it, that's the thing that stood out to me the most. So here's the passage from the Bible that I'd like us to read together. It's Ephesians 4. There's a couple places where Paul uses the metaphor of the human body to describe the church, where we all belong to each other. We all belong to Christ. We are unified behind the same purpose. We're all connected to the same God, but we are different. And so there's a sense of unity and diversity, shared purpose, different function. Everyone's involved. We can't say we can do this all on our own. We really do need everyone. There's a couple instances where he uses language like that. Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians 12. But we'll read this passage from Ephesians 4. It starts in verse 11. And I want you to listen for the standard or the expectation or the high bar that God sets for all of us as members of the body of Christ. And in the back of your mind, think about maybe the way that we like to redefine that or water that down. Like what is our definition of what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a member of the church? And let's compare that to what God says here. Ephesians 4, verse 11. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is, Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Now that's a sort of a long, involved passage, and there's some long sentences there. It just feels like it keeps going and going. Paul says, we're going to do this so that this will happen, and then that'll happen, and then we'll reach this goal. So there's a lot to it. But what were you hearing as God's expectations for being a member of the body of Christ, or maybe God's standard that he wants us to try and live up to when it comes to following Jesus? So what were some of the specific things you heard about God's standard or expectations for us? Victor?
So this reminds me of that when Paul refers to the race, finish the race. And so the race, so what he's describing here is how we get to the finish line. And the thing that really stood out was that last part that says each part does its work. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a preacher or a teacher, but remember the other passage you and I have talked about, was that in Corinthians, or where it talks about encouragers, the list?
Oh, yeah.
List?
Yeah.
It's maybe in Timothy. I think it's in Timothy, 1 Timothy, where he talks about being encouragers. But each part, that means you're not a spectator.
Yeah.
That you are participating somehow, whatever that might be, in the work to be mature and complete and finish the race. For the whole body, not just a few people, the whole body to finish the race.
Yeah. We want to finish the race together. Yeah. We don't want to have one person trying to run ahead and leaving everyone else behind. Yeah. So each person has work to do, right? That's kind of one of the points here. Yeah. Jeff?
What I kept hearing over and over again is the word maturity.
Yeah. That's in there a few times.
I think of my wife. She's a kindergarten teacher. And all of us, we're at a certain age where we start that education process. But we can't stay there. That's for a time. We have to keep maturing. We have to keep growing. If I wanted to stay a kindergartner at the ripe old age of 52, what does that say about me? But so many areas of our lives, we acquiesce towards that.
Yeah, I heard this described, I think it was by Peter Scazzaro. He talks about like a Christian who's been a Christian for 25 years. He says some Christians have 25 years of following Jesus, and some Christians have 1 year following Jesus 25 times. It's just that they never really mature. They just they stay in the same place year after year after year. They don't really have the maturity or the experience of a 25-year-old Christian. It's just that they've been a baby Christian 25 years in a row. So what Paul is calling us to, and he does use that word a few times, maturity, it involves growing up. It involves a new mindset. It involves different attitudes. But yeah, there's a call to maturity here in verse 13. I saw one in verse 15. And I can't remember if it's in the last verse as well. But at least two, then there might be more, references to maturity, right? Good. Jane?
This reminds me of when they were going to build the temple. I mean, not the temple, tabernacle.
Okay.
And God sent the Holy Spirit onto two guys who were going to be in charge of the crafts. In other words, they didn't have these skills. God gave them the talent to have these skills. And so all we have to do is figure out what our skill is. And if your skill is a greeter, if your skill is mowing the lawn, whatever your skill is, once you find it, you know it's God-given, and then use it.
Yeah. There's a lot of passages that talk about the Spirit is the giver of gifts, that He enables us to do things for the Lord that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. And sometimes it coincides with our natural passions and talents and things that God sort of built into our DNA. But other times it's like, I don't know where that came from. I just had the Spirit of God working through me in that. Yeah. So, Jessica?
As a background of a nurse, I view these scriptures kind of from a physical sense of, like when 1 Corinthians talks about how Jesus is the head, and our head is our brain, and our body cannot function without the brain. It can't do anything that it needs to do. And so I think sometimes we get kind of caught up in, if we're supposed to be unified, but we're also different, how is that possible? But if Christ is really the head and our brain is centered on Him, there's not going to be any limitations to what we can do.
Yeah.
We kind of forget that necessity and think it's us or it's our skills or it's something that, we have to be doing, but when that's our constant focus.
Yeah.
That's what's kind of controlling our actions, just like our brain tells our body what to do. Christ tells us as a body what to do.
That's right. Yeah, we submit to Christ because Jesus is in charge. The Spirit is leading, not us. We are part of a body, but we are not in control of the body. We are a member of the church, but we are not in control or in charge of Jesus' church, right? He's the head. So like Franklin's sermon last week of we are following the Spirit. We are not trying to dictate to the Spirit where the Spirit needs to go. We are following the Spirit's lead. We are following Jesus' lead because he is the head of the church. And yeah, that's where the brain is, and that's, yeah, absolutely. Go back a slide, he says. Okay, to the first.
So how about that? So let's look at verse 12. To equip his people for works of service. So implicit in there is the people have to be learning from the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, etc., etc. So there's a duty. Now, of course, there's a duty to those people to be doing that properly. And there's that passage as well that you and I have spoken about teachers. We have what's the standard? There's the standard, the bar for us is twice as high because we don't want to be false teachers or false prophets. But it's also the duty of those people to learn from those people so they can be equipped, whatever those works of service. So the body is working together, but it's not just the responsibility of the preacher and the teacher and whoever else. It's also the responsibility of the people to say, I will learn and let the Spirit lead me to whatever those good works of service are going to be.
That's right. And I think that goes back to maturity as well. Just thinking about my relationship with my kids. When my kids were very little, we had to do everything for them because that's the stage of life that they're in. When they're babies, like they can't do anything on their own, so you do it for them. As they grow and mature, you start to identify the tasks that they can and should start doing for themselves. So my role shifts from being the person who does it to being the parent who teaches my kids how to do it. And they don't like that all the time because they like when mom and dad get their snacks for them. I'm watching TV and they're watching TV. Hey, Dad, can I have some Lucky Charms, some marshmallows and stars? Sure, you can. It's in the pantry. You know where the bowls are. You can get it. And then what's my kid's reaction? Aww, because I thought you were going to do it for me, Dad. And so, yeah, there's things where I am trying to equip them to solve certain problems for themselves. They're not necessarily equipable in their attitude. They're not willing to be trained. And that's sort of an issue of maturity, right? So an immature Christian would look at the leaders of the church and say, well, they're supposed to do it. They're the leaders. That's why we pay them. That's why we have these people on staff or volunteering as elders or deacons or ministry leaders. We have them so that the regular church members don't have to do so much, right? That's a very sort of immature attitude. Maturity is we have these leaders. They're going to spend a lot of their time equipping and empowering and teaching the people to go and do ministry. And then instead of having 5 elders plus 4 ministers doing ministry, we've got 9 equippers who are training 250 Southwest members to go and do ministry. Which one is going to be more effective? The one where a lot of people are working, right? So, yeah. Well, it's 9:42. Our time is almost up. So let me just kind of summarize what we've talked about so far in this chapter. The issue that he identifies is churchianity, trying to define God's things according to human standards, watering down what the goal is, and then congratulating ourselves and doing a fantastic job of, well, doing Christianity in a way that God never actually asks us to do. We've watered down the goal and then feel really good about meeting that watered down goal. We switch from 3 tacos to 2 and think that we've basically done what God has asked us when he says run that 10K. So that's the problem that he identified. Next week, we're going to wrap up with the last chapter in the book, which is about the power of prayer, which I feel like I just preached a sermon on that, but it'll be good to revisit that topic. And there's a really cool story about this revival that broke out just through the power of prayer in New York City. I'll tell you about that, and then we can share some thoughts and reflections about the book and the material we've talked about. So that'll be next week. All right, thank you guys so much for coming, and I look forward to worshiping with you here in a few more minutes.